If you drive through the Buckinghamshire countryside, past the village of Taplow, you will eventually come to a set of ornate gates marked only by a simple sign, Cliveden. Beyond those gates, a long drive winds through 376 acres of formal gardens and ancient woodland, climbing steadily until it reaches the top of a chalk cliff that rises 180 feet above the River Thames. And there, commanding a view across the Thames Valley that stretches for miles in every direction, stands one of the most beautiful houses in England, Cliveden House. 3 stories of honey-coloured bathstone with a classical facade designed by Charles Barry, the same architect who built the Houses of Parliament. Formal terraces drop away from the house in geometric precision. Ancient yews frame vistas that landscape designers have spent centuries perfecting. What you are looking at is the 3rd house to stand on this site. Each of the previous 2 burned to the ground. And each of the 3 houses, the one that stands today included, has been touched by scandal so profound that it shaped the course of British history. Because Cliveden is not simply a beautiful country house, it is a place where adultery led to murder, where the richest man in America fled to escape his past, where the first woman to sit in Parliament held court, and where, in the 1930s, a group of aristocrats and politicians gathered for weekend parties that may have encouraged Adolf Hitler to believe Britain would never fight. This is the dark story of Britain's most scandalous manor, Cliveden House. The first house was built by a man whose very name was synonymous with scandal. George Villiers, the 2nd Duke of Buckingham, acquired the land at Cliveden in 1666, just months after the Great Fire of London had destroyed much of the capital. Villiers was one of the most notorious figures of the Restoration Court, a favourite of Charles II, a member of the infamous group of courtiers known as the Cabal, and a man whose personal life was a catalogue of excess, violence, and betrayal. Buckingham chose the site for its commanding position above the Thames, but also for its privacy. Because he was planning to build more than just a country house, he was building a refuge for an affair that would end in death. The woman was Anna Maria Brudenell, the Countess of Shrewsbury. She was married to Francis Talbot, the 11th Earl of Shrewsbury, but that marriage was merely a political arrangement. Her heart and her body belonged to Buckingham. The affair was conducted with a brazenness that shocked even the libertine court of Charles II. Buckingham would arrive at social gatherings with the Countess on his arm, while her husband looked on. They lived together openly at his London residence. When she became pregnant with his child, he made no attempt to hide his paternity. But the Earl of Shrewsbury would not be cuckolded indefinitely. On the 16th of January, 1668, at 9 o'clock in the morning, 4 men met in a field at Barn Elms, just outside London. The Earl of Shrewsbury and his second, the Duke of Buckingham and his. The cause was honour. The method was swords. And according to one witness, who may have been the Countess herself, disguised as a page, she watched from the sidelines as her lover and her husband fought to the death. The duel was swift and decisive. Buckingham's blade found its mark. The Earl of Shrewsbury died on the spot, his blood soaking into the January frost. What happened next defied every convention of aristocratic society. Rather than fleeing into exile, as was customary, after killing a man in a duel, Buckingham returned to court. King Charles II, who had forbidden duelling but rarely enforced the prohibition, welcomed him back. And the Countess of Shrewsbury, now a widow, moved into Buckingham's house as his mistress, taking her place in society as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. The affair, once merely scandalous, had become notorious. Satirists across London wrote verses about the Duke who had killed a man for his wife, and the woman who had watched her husband die. John Dryden, the playwright and poet, immortalised Buckingham in his play Absalom and Achitophel as a figure of dangerous charm and moral corruption. Samuel Pepys recorded in his diary that the entire court was much troubled by the affair and its violent conclusion. It was into this atmosphere of notoriety and social exile that Buckingham poured his energy into building Cliveden. The first house, completed around 1668, was unlike anything that had been built in England before. Instead of the traditional English manor house, with its medieval roots and domestic scale, Buckingham created something that resembled an Italian palazzo. The building was vast, 3 stories high, with wings extending in both directions from a central block. The facade was classical, inspired by the Renaissance villas that Buckingham had seen during his travels in Italy. Inside, the rooms were decorated with paintings, sculptures, and furniture collected from across Europe. But the house's most remarkable feature was its position. Built on the very edge of the chalk cliff, Cliveden seemed to float above the Thames Valley like a classical temple. The effect was both beautiful and unnerving, a house that appeared to have been lifted from the landscape of ancient Rome and deposited in the Buckinghamshire countryside. The house was also designed for pleasure. The state drawing room could accommodate 50 guests for dinner. There were private apartments for intimate gatherings. The gardens, laid out in the formal French style, included hidden grottos and secret pathways where lovers could meet away from prying eyes. This was not simply a family home, it was a palace of seduction, and it worked exactly as Buckingham had intended. Cliveden became the setting for some of the most extravagant entertainments of the Restoration era. Kings and queens visited. Foreign ambassadors were received with ceremonies that rivaled Versailles. The house parties lasted for weeks, with guests arriving by barge from London and departing in a haze of wine, gambling, and sexual intrigue. But the house's reputation was forever linked to its builder's crime. Visitors knew they were sleeping under the roof of a man who had killed for love. The Countess of Shrewsbury, who bore Buckingham a son in 1670, presided over the entertainments with the quiet dignity of a woman who had watched her husband die for her sake. The combination of beauty, wealth, and violence gave Cliveden an atmosphere that was both magnetic and sinister. When Buckingham died in 1687, he left behind debts that consumed most of his estate. The Countess had predeceased him by 5 years, and their son had died in infancy. Cliveden passed through a series of owners, none of whom could afford to maintain it in the style to which it had become accustomed. The house fell into disrepair. The gardens grew wild. By the middle of the 18th century, Cliveden had become a symbol of faded glory, a monument to the dangerous excesses of the Restoration Court. And then, on a winter night in 1795, the first house burned to the ground. The fire started in the early hours of the morning, possibly in the servants' quarters. By the time it was discovered, flames had already spread through the wooden floors and panelled walls of the interior. There was no fire brigade. The nearest water source was the Thames, 180 feet below. Servants and neighbours formed a human chain, passing buckets of water up the cliff face, but it was hopeless. The fire consumed everything. The state drawing room, where Charles II had dined. The private apartments where the Countess of Shrewsbury had lived. The library that contained Buckingham's collection of rare books and manuscripts. By morning, only the outer walls remained standing, blackened and empty against the winter sky. The ruins stood empty for nearly 30 years. Local people said the site was cursed, that the blood spilled in the duel had poisoned the ground. Children dared each other to walk through the charred remains after dark. Ghost stories began to circulate about the Countess of Shrewsbury, said to wander the cliff edge where her lover's house had once stood. Then, in 1824, Sir George Warrender, a Scottish politician and businessman, bought the estate. Warrender was everything that Buckingham had not been: respectable, moral, devoted to his wife and children. He saw Cliveden not as a palace of pleasure, but as a family home. The second house, completed in 1827, was smaller than its predecessor, built in a restrained Georgian style that spoke of good taste rather than ostentation. For 22 years, the Warrender family lived quietly at Cliveden. There were no scandals, no duels, no notorious house parties. The house fulfilled its builder's vision of domestic respectability. And then, on May 20th, 1849, it burned again. This fire was even more devastating than the first. It started in the afternoon when the family was at home. Sir George Warrender himself was in the library when he smelled smoke. By the time the household realised the extent of the danger, the fire had cut off the main staircase. Family members escaped by climbing out of upper-storey windows onto ladders held by servants. The Warrenders lost everything: furniture, paintings, books, family papers that dated back centuries, 2 houses, 2 fires, both structures completely destroyed. The local newspapers began to write about the Cliveden curse. Superstitious visitors claimed that the ghost of the Earl of Shrewsbury had returned to claim revenge on anyone who tried to live where his murderer had built his palace. Others pointed to the geology of the site. The chalk cliff was unstable, they argued, prone to earth movements that could damage chimneys and create fire hazards. The more practically minded suggested that both fires had been caused by faulty flues, exacerbated by the house's exposed position above the river, where high winds could turn a small blaze into an inferno. But the truth was simpler and more disturbing. Cliveden seemed to attract misfortune in the same way that it attracted visitors. Something about the house, its history, its position, perhaps simply the ambitions of the people who lived there, created conditions where disaster could flourish. After the second fire, the Warrender family sold the estate. The ruins were cleared away. The site lay empty once again, as if waiting for someone bold enough to tempt fate a third time. That someone was William Waldorf Astor. In 1893, Astor paid £1.25 million for the Cliveden estate, a sum so vast that it was headline news across Britain. To put this in context, £1.25 million in 1893 had the purchasing power of approximately £150 million today. Astor had not simply bought a house. He had bought one of the most expensive private residences in the world. But then, William Waldorf Astor was the richest man in America. Born in New York in 1848, Astor was the great-grandson of John Jacob Astor, the German immigrant who had built the Astor family fortune through fur trading, real estate speculation, and shrewd investments in Manhattan property. By the 1890s, the Astor family owned vast swaths of New York City. Their wealth was estimated at over $100 million, making them richer than most sovereign nations. William Waldorf had been groomed from birth to manage this empire. He attended Harvard Law School, traveled extensively in Europe, and entered politics as a Republican. In 1882, he was appointed United States Minister to Italy, where he lived in a palazzo in Rome and developed a taste for European aristocratic society that would define the rest of his life. But when he returned to New York in 1885, Astor discovered that American society would never accept him as the aristocrat he believed himself to be. Despite his wealth, his education, and his political connections, he remained a mere businessman in a country that did not believe in titles or inherited privilege. The final insult came in 1890, when the social registers of New York listed his wife not as Mrs. William Waldorf Astor, but as Mrs. Astor Jr., indicating that his aunt, Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, was still considered the head of the family. Astor's response was characteristically dramatic. In 1891, he announced that he was leaving America forever. "America is not a fit place for a gentleman to live," he told reporters. He sold his American properties, moved his family to London, and began the process of recreating himself as a British aristocrat. Cliveden was to be the centerpiece of this transformation. Astor commissioned the architect Charles Barry, son of the Charles Barry who had designed the Houses of Parliament, to build a third house on the cursed site. This time, nothing was left to chance. The new Cliveden would be fireproof. The structure would be built of stone and steel. The decorations would be the finest that money could buy, and the house would be larger and more magnificent than either of its predecessors. Construction began in 1893 and continued for 3 years. The house that emerged was a masterpiece of Victorian confidence and American money. 3 stories of bathstone rose from terraces that seemed to grow from the cliff itself. The entrance hall was lined with marble columns. The staircase was carved from a single block of granite. The state drawing room could seat 100 guests for dinner. Every room was fitted with electric lighting, still a novelty in the 1890s, and a revolutionary central heating system that ensured the house would be comfortable year-round. But Astor's greatest achievement was not architectural. It was social. Within 5 years of moving to Britain, he had managed something that no amount of American money had been able to buy: acceptance by the British establishment. In 1899, he became a British citizen. In 1916, he was elevated to the peerage as Baron Astor of Hever Castle. The boy from New York had become a member of the House of Lords. The key to this transformation was Cliveden itself. The house parties that Astor hosted became legendary. Cabinet ministers, foreign ambassadors, members of the royal family, all made the journey to Buckinghamshire to dine at Astor's table and sleep in his perfectly appointed guest rooms. The conversations that took place over weekend gatherings at Cliveden influenced government policy, shaped diplomatic relations, and determined the direction of British society. But it was Astor's son, Waldorf, and his daughter-in-law, Nancy, who would make Cliveden truly powerful. Waldorf Astor inherited Cliveden when his father died in 1919. But the real force behind the house's influence was his wife, Nancy Witcher Langhorne Astor, an American-born socialite who had married into the British aristocracy and transformed herself into one of the most formidable political figures of her generation. Nancy Astor was everything her father-in-law had aspired to be, but never quite achieved. Where William Waldorf had been accepted by British society, Nancy conquered it. In 1919, when her husband inherited his father's peerage and was forced to give up his seat in the House of Commons, Nancy stood for election in his place. She won, becoming the first woman to take her seat in the British Parliament. The symbolism was perfect. The American heiress, who had married into the British aristocracy, was now helping to shape the laws of her adopted country, and Cliveden became the unofficial headquarters of her political operation. The weekend house parties that Nancy Astor hosted at Cliveden in the 1920s and 1930s were unlike anything Britain had seen before. This was not simply social entertaining, it was political networking on an unprecedented scale. Cabinet ministers would arrive on Friday evening and spend the weekend in intense discussion about government policy. Foreign diplomats would conduct unofficial negotiations over dinner. Newspaper editors would be briefed on government thinking during walks through the gardens. The guest lists read like a directory of the British establishment. Winston Churchill was a regular visitor, as were Lord Halifax, Lord Lothian, and Geoffrey Dawson, the editor of the Times. American ambassadors made pilgrimages to Cliveden to understand British thinking. German diplomats were received with the same hospitality as their French counterparts, but it was during the 1930s that these weekend gatherings took on a darker significance. As Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany and began his aggressive expansion across Europe, the British government faced a series of agonizing decisions about how to respond. Should Britain rearm and prepare for war? Should it try to negotiate with Hitler and find a peaceful solution to German grievances? Or should it take a firm stand and risk another devastating European conflict just 20 years after the end of the First World War? These questions were debated endlessly in Parliament, in newspaper editorials, and in private conversations across London. But some of the most influential discussions took place at Cliveden, around Nancy Astor's dinner table. The group that gathered at these weekend parties became known, somewhat unfairly, as the Cliveden Set. They were not a formal organisation. They had no official policy positions. They did not meet regularly or coordinate their activities, but they shared a worldview that would have profound consequences for British foreign policy in the years leading up to the Second World War. The Cliveden Set believed that war with Germany could and should be avoided. They argued that Hitler's grievances against the Treaty of Versailles were legitimate, and that if Britain made reasonable concessions, the German leader could be transformed from a potential enemy into a peaceful partner. The leading figures in this group included Lord Lothian, a former Liberal MP who served as Nancy Astor's political advisor, Geoffrey Dawson, editor of the Times, whose newspaper editorials consistently argued for appeasement, and Lord Halifax, who would later serve as Foreign Secretary under Neville Chamberlain. They were joined by a rotating cast of politicians, diplomats, and intellectuals who shared their conviction that accommodation with Hitler was both possible and necessary. The tragedy of the Cliveden Set was not that they were Nazi sympathizers. Most were genuinely horrified by Hitler's domestic policies and his treatment of Jews. Rather, it was that their privileged position in British society, their experience of the carnage of the First World War, and their genuine desire for peace blinded them to the true nature of the threat they were facing. The conversations that took place at Cliveden during these crucial years were reported back to Berlin through various channels. German diplomats who attended the house parties filed detailed reports about British thinking. Some historians argue that Hitler's confidence in invading Poland in September 1939 was based partly on intelligence suggesting that Britain would not fight, intelligence that may have been gathered inadvertently around Nancy Astor's dining table. By the time war was declared, the damage was done. The Cliveden set was disbanded in all but name, its members scattered to various government positions where they would spend the next 6 years trying to win a war they had helped make inevitable. But Cliveden itself was transformed. Within weeks of the declaration of war in September 1939, Nancy Astor made a decision that would define the house's role for the next 6 years. She offered Cliveden to the Canadian Red Cross as a military hospital. The transformation was swift and dramatic. The state drawing room, where cabinet ministers had debated foreign policy, was converted into a surgical ward. The long gallery, hung with priceless tapestries and paintings, became a rehabilitation centre for soldiers recovering from wounds. The bedrooms that had accommodated foreign ambassadors and newspaper editors were fitted with hospital beds for officers convalescing from battle injuries. By Christmas 1939, Cliveden had become the Canadian Red Cross Special Hospital. The first patients arrived in early 1940, Canadian airmen who had been shot down over France, soldiers wounded in the early campaigns of the war, and later casualties from Dunkirk, North Africa, and D-Day. The sight of wounded soldiers in the Grand Ballroom created one of the most poignant images of the Second World War. Men who had lost limbs in the deserts of Egypt lay in beds beneath crystal chandeliers. Burn victims from the Battle of Britain received treatment in rooms where their political leaders had once danced. The juxtaposition of human suffering and aristocratic luxury gave the hospital an almost surreal quality that visitors never forgot. Nancy Astor threw herself into the work with characteristic energy. Every morning, she would walk through the wards, talking to patients, writing letters to their families, and ensuring that the medical staff had everything they needed. She had found, at last, a role that matched her talents and her conscience. The woman who had once entertained fascist sympathizers now spent her days caring for the men who were fighting fascism. The patients adored her. Her American directness, combined with her aristocratic connections, made her an irresistible combination of mother figure and society celebrity. She could arrange for a wounded soldier to speak to his family in Canada, or ensure that a particular specialist was brought in for a difficult case. When patients were well enough, she would take them for drives through the grounds, pointing out the gardens and explaining the history of the house that was helping to heal them. The hospital remained operational throughout the war and into the peacetime. By the time it finally closed in 1947, over 4,000 soldiers had been treated at Cliveden. Many recovered completely and returned to active duty. Others were invalided out of service, but returned to civilian life with their wounds healed and their spirits restored. Some died in the wards, where politicians had once plotted, their bodies buried in the local churchyard within sight of the house that had tried to save them. The war years represented a kind of redemption for Cliveden. The house that had been built for pleasure, corrupted by politics, and tainted by its association with appeasement, had found a noble purpose. For 8 years, it had served not the powerful, but the powerless, young men broken by war who needed healing more than they needed luxury. When the hospital closed and the house returned to private use, many assumed that Cliveden's days of notoriety were over. The Astor family had sold the estate to the National Trust in 1942, though they retained a lease on the house itself. Nancy Astor, now in her 70s, divided her time between Cliveden and her other properties. The weekend house parties resumed, but on a much smaller scale. The guests were old friends rather than government ministers. The conversations were about gardening and grandchildren rather than affairs of state. For more than a decade, Cliveden remained quietly respectable. And then, on a warm summer evening in July 1961, scandal returned to the house by the Thames. The setting was not the main house, but Spring Cottage, a small property on the Cliveden estate that had been rented to Dr. Stephen Ward, a society osteopath whose clients included members of the royal family, government ministers, and foreign diplomats. Ward was one of those figures who seemed to exist on the margins of power, charming, well-connected, and slightly mysterious. He treated the back problems of politicians and the nervous tensions of their wives. He sketched portraits of the famous and introduced young women to older men who might advance their careers. Ward's cottage was the perfect venue for the kind of discreet entertainment that powerful men required. It was private, comfortable, and removed from the prying eyes of London society. The cottage had its own swimming pool, surrounded by gardens that offered complete seclusion. On weekends, Ward would host small parties that brought together an eclectic mix of guests: government ministers, foreign diplomats, journalists, and young women who worked as models, dancers, or call girls. It was at one of these parties, on a summer evening in 1961, that John Profumo first saw Christine Keeler. Profumo was the Secretary of State for War, a cabinet minister in Harold Macmillan's Conservative government, and one of the most powerful men in Britain. At 56, he was married to a former film actress, lived in a grand house in Regent's Park, and seemed destined for even higher office. He was also a man who took considerable risks in his personal life. Christine Keeler was 19 years old, strikingly beautiful, and completely out of place in Ward's sophisticated circle. She had grown up in poverty in the Thames Valley, left school at 15, and worked as a dancer at Murray's Cabaret Club in Soho. Ward had met her through the club and had begun including her in his weekend parties, where her beauty and working-class directness provided an interesting contrast to the usual guests. On the night they met, Keeler was swimming naked in Ward's pool when Profumo arrived unexpectedly. According to her later testimony, she had forgotten to bring a towel and had to borrow a shirt from another guest to cover herself. Profumo, despite his political position and his marriage, was immediately smitten. What followed was a brief but intense affair that would destroy Profumo's career and bring down a government. They met secretly at Ward's cottage, where Profumo would arrive in his ministerial car and spend hours talking and making love with the teenager, who called him Johnny. He bought her expensive gifts, jewelry, clothes, and a car, and spoke to her about his work in terms that he would never have used with other women. The affair might have remained secret if not for the other man in Christine Keeler's life. Captain Yevgeny Ivanov was a Soviet naval attaché at the Russian embassy in London. Officially, he was a cultural liaison, attending parties and cultivating relationships with British officials. In reality, he was a senior intelligence officer whose job was to gather information about British military capabilities and political thinking. Ivanov had also met Keeler through Stephen Ward, who seemed to delight in introducing his guests to one another without regard for the potential consequences. The Russian officer was handsome, sophisticated, and exotic in a way that appealed to a young woman who had grown up in provincial England. Like Profumo, he began sleeping with Keeler, apparently unaware that she was simultaneously involved with the British War Minister. The situation was a security nightmare waiting to happen. Profumo had access to the most sensitive military secrets in Britain, information about nuclear weapons, NATO strategy, and intelligence operations. Keeler was sleeping with both him and a Soviet intelligence officer, potentially creating a direct channel between the British government and the KGB. And Stephen Ward, who had orchestrated the entire situation, seemed to be encouraging rather than preventing these dangerous connections. The first hint of trouble came in early 1962, when MI5 became aware of Ivanov's relationship with Keeler. British intelligence had been watching the Soviet officer since his arrival in London, and his frequent visits to Ward's cottage had been noted. When they discovered that Keeler was also involved with Profumo, alarm bells began ringing throughout the security services. MI5 approached Profumo and told him to end the relationship immediately. They briefed him on Ivanov's real role and explained the security implications of his involvement with Keeler. Profumo, horrified by the potential consequences, broke off the affair and tried to distance himself from Ward's circle entirely, but it was too late. The scandal was already beginning to unravel in ways that none of the participants could control. The first public hint came in March 1963, when Christine Keeler failed to appear as a witness in the trial of a former lover who had been charged with shooting at her. Newspapers began investigating why a key witness had disappeared, and gradually the story of her relationships with Profumo and Ivanov began to emerge. On the 22nd of March 1963, Profumo made a statement to the House of Commons denying any improper relationship with Keeler. "There was no impropriety whatever in my acquaintanceship with Miss Keeler," he told Parliament. "It was a lie, told under oath, and it would ultimately destroy him." For 10 weeks, Profumo maintained his innocence, while journalists continued to investigate the story. The pressure on him was enormous. His wife stood by him publicly, but their marriage was under terrible strain. His colleagues in the government began to distance themselves, sensing that the scandal would eventually consume anyone associated with it. And Profumo himself, a proud man who had built his career on his reputation for integrity, was forced to lie repeatedly to save his political life. On the 4th of June 1963, he finally confessed. In a letter to the Prime Minister, Profumo admitted that he had lied to Parliament and resigned from the government immediately. "I have to acknowledge that some of my statements were misleading," he wrote, "and I am sorry that I should have misled my colleagues and the House." The confession triggered the biggest political scandal in post-war British history. Parliament was in uproar. The press was in a frenzy. Opposition politicians demanded the resignation of the entire government, arguing that if Profumo could lie to Parliament about his personal life, how could he be trusted on matters of national security? Prime Minister Harold Macmillan tried to contain the damage, but the scandal had taken on a life of its own. The story had everything that the British public found irresistible: sex, spies, aristocrats, and a government minister who had been caught in a lie. The fact that it had all taken place at Cliveden, with its history of scandal and political intrigue, made it even more compelling. The security implications were genuinely serious. MI5 launched a massive investigation to determine whether state secrets had been passed to the Soviet Union through the Profumo-Keeler-Ivanov triangle. They interviewed everyone who had been present at Ward's parties, examined government documents that Profumo had accessed, and tried to reconstruct every conversation that might have taken place between the participants. The investigation found no evidence that classified information had actually been transmitted to Moscow. Profumo, despite his personal failings, appeared to have been careful not to discuss sensitive matters with Keeler. Ivanov, for his part, seemed more interested in the social aspects of his relationship with the young woman than in any intelligence-gathering opportunities it might provide. But the absence of actual espionage did not diminish the political damage. The scandal had revealed a level of recklessness at the heart of government that shocked even a public accustomed to political hypocrisy. A cabinet minister had been sleeping with a teenager who was simultaneously involved with a Soviet intelligence officer. He had lied to Parliament to cover up his actions, and he had done it all while having access to the most sensitive military secrets in Britain. The man who paid the heaviest price was Stephen Ward. As the scandal unfolded, it became clear that someone would have to take responsibility for the security breach. Ward, who had no political protection and few powerful friends, became the designated scapegoat. In June 1963, Ward was arrested and charged with living off immoral earnings, essentially with being a pimp. The charges were based on the prosecution's argument that he had introduced young women to older men and had profited from the relationships that resulted. The case was legally dubious and politically motivated, but it served the government's purpose of deflecting blame from the real security failures onto a convenient target. Ward's trial began in July 1963, and it became a media circus. Christine Keeler and other young women testified about the parties at Spring Cottage, the prominent men they had met, and the money that had changed hands. Ward, representing himself, tried to argue that he was merely a social facilitator who had introduced consenting adults to one another. But the weight of the establishment was against him. On July 30th, 1963, the day before the jury was due to retire to consider its verdict, Stephen Ward took an overdose of sleeping pills at his flat in Chelsea. He left a note saying, "I am sorry to disappoint the vultures." He died 3 days later without regaining consciousness. Christine Keeler was eventually sentenced to 9 months in prison for perjury related to her testimony in another case. She served her time and then spent decades trying to escape the notoriety that the scandal had brought her. Yevgeny Ivanov was quietly recalled to Moscow, where he lived out the rest of his life in obscurity. John Profumo, meanwhile, began a long journey toward redemption. After resigning from Parliament, he disappeared from public life completely. He took a job as a volunteer at Toynbee Hall, a charity in London's East End, where he worked with the homeless and disadvantaged. For the next 40 years, he dedicated himself to social work, never giving interviews, never seeking to justify his actions, and never attempting to return to political life. His quiet dignity in the face of disgrace eventually restored his reputation. When he died in 2006, he was mourned as a man who had made a terrible mistake, but had spent the rest of his life trying to atone for it. The Queen, who had been deeply angered by the scandal in 1963, eventually awarded him a CBE for his charitable work. Harold Macmillan never fully recovered from the affair. The scandal contributed to his decision to resign as Prime Minister in October 1963, citing ill health. The Conservative Party lost the following year's election to Harold Wilson's Labour Party, ending 13 years of Tory rule. But perhaps the most lasting damage was to the British establishment itself. The Profumo affair revealed a world of privilege and hypocrisy that shocked a public already beginning to question the deference that had characterized British society since the war. The scandal marked the beginning of the end of the old order, the world of gentlemen's agreements, class privilege, and establishment cover-ups that had dominated British politics for centuries. And it had all begun at Cliveden, in the swimming pool where Christine Keeler had met John Profumo on that summer evening in 1961. Today, Cliveden operates as one of Britain's most exclusive hotels. The house that once hosted cabinet ministers and Soviet spies now welcomes guests who pay hundreds of pounds per night to sleep in rooms where history was made. The State Drawing Room is now a restaurant. The Long Gallery, where wounded soldiers once recovered, is used for weddings and corporate events. The swimming pool at Spring Cottage, where the Profumo affair began, is still there. Hotel guests can book it for private parties, swimming in the same water where Christine Keeler once caught the eye of a cabinet minister. The cottage itself has been converted into luxury accommodation, its bedrooms and sitting rooms carefully restored to their 1960s appearance. The National Trust maintains the gardens and grounds, which remain some of the most beautiful in England. Visitors can walk through the formal terraces, explore the hidden groves where the Duke of Buckingham once entertained his mistress, and stand at the cliff edge looking out over the Thames Valley that has witnessed so much history. But Cliveden's past refuses to stay buried. Hotel staff report strange occurrences throughout the building. Doors that open and close by themselves, cold spots in the Long Gallery, and electrical equipment that malfunctions without explanation. Guests have reported seeing a woman in white near the parterre gardens, always at dusk, always alone. Some believe it is the ghost of the Countess of Shrewsbury, still wandering the grounds where her lover built his palace of pleasure. Others have reported hearing voices in the State Drawing Room late at night, the sound of animated conversation, as if a dinner party were in progress, though the others have reported hearing voices in the State Drawing Room late at night. The sound of animated conversation, as if a dinner party were in progress, though the room stands empty and silent when investigated. Perhaps these are echoes of the Profumo affair gatherings, where politicians and socialites mingled with dangerous secrets. Or maybe they are whispers from earlier scandals, the gambling debts that ruined fortunes, the illicit affairs that toppled governments, the wartime intrigues that shape nations. The staff at Cliveden have grown accustomed to such phenomena, doors that open by themselves, footsteps in empty corridors, the faint sound of piano music drifting from rooms where no instrument plays. They speak of these occurrences matter-of-factly, as if the very walls have absorbed centuries of drama and passion. Today, Cliveden operates as a luxury hotel, welcoming guests who come seeking elegance and tranquility. Yet beneath the polished service and manicured gardens, the house retains its magnetic pull toward controversy and intrigue. Wedding parties and corporate retreats now fill rooms that once hosted spies and ministers, their modern celebrations layering new memories over old scandals. For at its heart, Cliveden remains what it has always been, a house born in scandal, nurtured by secrets, and destined never to escape its notorious past.